Welcome to week 3 of Buyer Behavior. In this lesson, you will continue to explore the psychological core of consumer behavior, and in particular, you will learn about 3 very important processes: exposure, attention, and perception. Now, there are 3 learning objectives for this lesson. First, we will discuss why marketers are concerned about consumers' exposure to marketing stimuli and what tactics they can use to make exposure more likely. Second, we will explain the characteristics of attention and how marketers can create offerings and messages that are more likely to catch consumers' attention. And lastly, we will describe the 5 major senses that are part of our perception and discuss some of their properties and their implications for marketing. Now, in order for any marketing stimulus to have an impact, consumers must first be exposed to it. Then they must allocate some attention to the stimulus, and finally they must perceive it through the 5 senses, which are sight, hearing, smell, taste, and touch. Now, perception and attention are mutually reinforcing processes. Some basic level of attention is needed to perceive a stimulus. But once a stimulus is perceived, further attention-based resources can be used to process stimuli at a higher level of processing. We'll talk about these higher levels of processing over the next couple of weeks when we discuss comprehension, learning, and memory. Now, just take a scenario as an example. For example, assume that Cirque du Soleil is advertising a new show in Melbourne, and one of the medias they've chosen to advertise the show on is on the side of buses. Now, how likely are you to consider going to the show? Well, first, the ad about the show has to reach you, and you will be reached or exposed to the ad only if you come in contact or are exposed to the ad about the show. In this case, the ad on the side of the bus. But then, even if you are exposed to it, you may still not pay attention to the ad because perhaps you may be talking on the phone when the bus drives by. And then finally, even if you pay attention, you may still not perceive or comprehend the ad correctly if the bus drives by quickly and you, for example, get the impression that the ad is for an animation movie or online game. So exposure is the very first threshold through which a marketing stimulus has to go so that it has any impact on consumers. We define exposure as the process by which consumers come into contact with a stimulus. Now, let's see what the effects of exposure are and why exposure is important. Now, the first and most obvious function of exposure, of course, is creating awareness. This is becoming more and more of a challenge these days, the more information consumers are bombarded with. That is why the cost of commercials in primetime TV, for example, has skyrocketed. For example, the cost of just a 30-second commercial during the Super Bowl, which is the most watched sporting event in the US, has increased roughly 8 times over the past 25 years. Now, exposure has some additional effects besides creating awareness. Repeated exposure, for example, to an object or a message increases liking for this object or message. This effect was discovered by a psychologist, Robert Zions, in 1968, and it is known as the so-called mere exposure effect. It applies to pretty much any type of stimulus. For example, think how sometimes when you hear a new song or album for the first time, you may not like it very much. But then the more you listen to it, the more the music grows on you. Now, this, of course, is true only up to a point. After a certain point, any additional repetitions can actually have the opposite effect, because then we get tired of the repeated stimulus. That is why we say that the relationship between repeated exposure and liking is best described by an inverted U-curve. Now, think of the implications of this in a marketing context, and in particular, for decisions such as how often to run a commercial. Marketers have to find the fine balance between too little exposure or too few repetitions and too much exposure or too many repetitions. Now, there is one more important effect related to repeated exposure. Assume, for example, that you read in a blog online that eating broccoli reduces blood pressure. Now, if you've never heard this before, you may doubt whether it's true. But if you have a vague memory of hearing it before, even though you can't remember exactly where you heard it, you may be more inclined to believe the truthfulness of this statement. So, familiarity with the statement or a message, which comes from repeated exposure to this statement or message, gives us the feeling of increased truthfulness. That is, the more often we come across a statement, the more likely we are to think that it's true. And again, think of the implications of this for advertising claims and their repetition, and the perceived truthfulness of these claims. So I hope I've convinced you of the importance of exposure. However, we should keep in mind that consumers can select not to be exposed to unwanted marketing messages. For example, they can block unwanted online ads, skip commercials while watching TV, fast forward through commercials, which is also known as zipping, or just switch between channels, which is called zapping. And there are more and more sophisticated software options on the market these days, which allow consumers to select what they get exposed to. So the old model of pushing advertising onto the consumer is no longer working. So what is the solution? So companies now understand the value of what we call targeted exposure. That is, targeting your advertising messages only to consumers who are likely to be interested in them, which again underlies the importance of personal relevance, which we discussed last week. Now, besides making exposure more targeted, companies can increase the likelihood of exposure also by various other means, such as, for example, selecting carefully the position of the message or the product. For example, ads which are placed on the front or back pages of magazines are likely to get a lot more exposure than ads which are placed inside a magazine. And products placed on shelves that are at the eye level of the target customer are also more likely to be seen and picked up.